For those of you who might be following this sermon in its printed form, I have added some further reflections since Jackie printed it for you on Friday, but I will return to the printed text, so please bear with me. I am remembering Easter 2016. A group of us from Carmen, 6 youth and 4 adults, arrived in the small community of Waspam, Nicaragua, on that Saturday afternoon. Preparations were well underway for the Easter procession and vigil, and everyone was keen to include us in this important yearly ritual of remembering those who had died, those who had gone before. The church bells woke us at 3:45 that Sunday morning, and while it was still fully dark outside, we prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, donning white garments as everyone else did for that occasion. But how would we know the way? We had just arrived the afternoon before. We were completely jet-lagged and bewildered. But as we stepped out of our compound into the dark night, we quickly realized that we would have no trouble finding our way. We simply followed the candlelit procession as streams of people dressed in white, holding candles, surged out of every dwelling and through every darkened street and laneway, a great cloud of witnesses to the ancestors whose memories were held in the cemetery, nestled between the town and the rainforest. The cemetery was already full of people as we arrived, people who had started arriving about 2 a.m. to sit vigil at their own family burial plot, or maybe at the gravesite of a friend or neighbor more recently bereaved. Some had chairs or blankets and thermoses of coffee and food. It was a very social, loud, active gathering of people, such as I had never experienced. And really, I was so overwhelmed, it took me till later to wonder what on earth the 6 youth that we were with were thinking of all of this and how they were processing it. As we drew near to the cemetery, it was aglow with candlelight and music, so much music. Everyone in the community of every age was gathering in the cemetery well before the dawn of Easter morning. I had traveled with some of the members of our group the previous day, and I was aware as we were traveling that we were literally flying over Good Friday as we flew south across North America and into Central America. Several members of our group had arrived in the capital city, Managua, a few days earlier, and so they were present to witness a spectacular Good Friday parade, which surprised them and maybe confused them with the depths of devotion, as many people actually walked on their knees for most of the long distance of this parade as a way to remember and pay homage to the suffering of Jesus on the cross. I reflected what a contrast this might be to our sometimes tendency as people of privilege in Canada to skip over the harsh realities of suffering embodied in Good Friday or in the daily news or in our lives, and in our attempt to leapfrog over and all the way straight to the joy of Easter morning. As we learned about the challenges and joys of life in Waspam that week with our hosts from the Moravian Church, I understood more deeply how they came to this wisdom of marking Good Friday as well as Easter in a wholehearted, whole-bodied way. Suffering and hope were close to the surface in their daily lives as they worked to build an adequate school building for their children, as they spent years without a working water treatment plant, a tiny forgotten mosquito community on the margins, far removed from the center of government power and influence. Only by acknowledging and responding to the depths of suffering could they understand the fullness of Easter's resurrection promise. Some of you, most of you, all of you, are here today to remember a beloved person who has died recently, and all of us will be reminded of our beloveds who have died over time. We hope and pray that this will be a gentle time of remembering together. And we also know that grief is hard work and often not gentle. Often, death and loss can leave us feeling very alone with our grief. We are remembering those we have loved with the blessed assurance that they and we and all God's creatures are loved and held in God's tender, strong embrace today and always. And in the Gospels, we see Jesus sharing our human condition, grieving with tears and heartache the death of his friends, making space for those on the margins. Especially often it is the widows and the children and those suffering from debilitating diseases. It was pleasant to remember the time in Nicaragua and to figure out how to share that with you, but it took me a while longer to figure out how to recognize the hard work of remembering that has been happening in Manitoba this year. But it feels like something that needs to be said as well as we gather for remembrance. Acts of remembrance are powerful. Sometimes they're comforting. Sometimes they're deeply troubling. They can be bold. They can be gentle. Sometimes they're raw with fresh or frustrated grief, or worn smooth by the passage of time and love's healing power. Sometimes our memories can be contained in a few carefully chosen words or actions. Other times they spill off the page and fill us with a complicated web of emotions as we reckon with how precious and fragile this one beautiful life is that we have to live and share. So it is important that we pay attention to what's been happening in our province and right here in our own communities as leadership from Long Plain First Nation, the Chief Kyra Wilson, and the families of Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, Tanya Nepanak, Buffalo Woman, Rebecca Quantois, Linda Beardy, and Joey English, and so many others have continued to name their names and demand that we remember them and help them remember them well. This has been bold, tenacious, public work. It has been uncomfortable, and it reminds us that this is our work to do when we follow Jesus, who is the peacemaker and the silence breaker, and the one in whose name we can remember with confidence all those we have loved. I encourage you to read more about those women. There's beautiful tributes to them on the Search the Landfill website that were too long to share in this service, and I didn't have their family's permission to do so, but it is important to remember them and the witness of this strong and powerful community, family members, women, and others who continue to ask us to remember them well. Naming those who have died over the past year, whether it is in such a public way or privately or in our church community, is a powerful and faithful act of remembrance because we are remembering people back into their continued place in our families, our fellowship and community. And we are touching the raw pain of grief and loss. We remember these people and these saints because their lives mattered to us. Their lives matter to God. Even if we don't know their names today, their lives matter to God. And honoring their lives helps us to honor our own pain and grief at the death of these dear ones and all those we have loved, and at the things still broken and unresolved among us as a people. Honoring our grief awakens us to the grief of others and gives us energy to do something about that. Paying attention to suffering and death in our world has the power to move us to further action and reflection, as one of our hymns last week declared, opening us to the joy and the pain of living. Remembering those who have gone before can inspire us to be good ancestors to the future yet unknown. These gentle acts of remembering are rooted in the love of God who remembers us, God who holds all creation in her steadying embrace. The scripture reading today from Matthew's Gospel spills over with blessings, perhaps reminding you of some of the saints you have known who have exemplified this blessed way of living by their humility, by their commitment to justice and fairness and peace, by their generosity, their mercy and kindness for people and places and creatures that might otherwise be overlooked or discounted. The portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that we commonly refer to as the Beatitudes, which Barb read for us, also helps us to remember the nature of God and God's intention for peace and justice in abundance for all God's creation. This vision is contained in the kingdom of heaven that is a cornerstone in this sermon that Jesus is preaching. Over and over in the Gospels, Jesus not only teaches about this mysterious kingdom that is already among us but not yet fulfilled, Jesus reveals this kingdom through his relationships with people on the edges of community, by his patient and sometimes impatient love of his disciples, through his raw emotions of anger, fear, anguish, and hope, expressed in tears and shouts and sometimes silent retreat to quiet out-of-the-way places. Perhaps we might look to the Beatitudes for some kind of prescription for good human behavior, and they're instructive in that sense. But really, I think they are about teaching us about who God is and how God is, and how Jesus is inviting each one of us to be part of building this blessed kingdom of heaven. Back in the cemetery in Waspam, Nicaragua, candlelight was slowly overtaken by the coming of the dawn. And as the eastern sky broke forth into light with the coming of the sunrise, the most amazing dawn chorus of birdsong erupted from the rainforest that surrounded us. It was a cacophony of praise that overwhelmed our senses and filled us with wonder and awe. I eagerly anticipated this early morning call to prayer every day that we stayed with the people of Waspam, and I was never disappointed, although some of the youth did tire of the rooster's persistent call. I returned home with my ears and my heart more finely tuned to hear and appreciate the somewhat subdued but still beautiful Manitoba version of this daily call to prayer and service. As we continue in our worship,